2010, the National Planning Commission created a diagnostic report of South Africa during the conceptualization stages of the New Development Plan, or the NDP. Now, the quality of education for black people was flagged as one of the 9 barriers in the development of the country. And this month, the NCP has released a document called Education and Skills for the Economy and Links to Labour Markets in South Africa, which is open for public comment. And as we continue to celebrate Youth Month, we focus on what has changed in the country's education system 44 years after the June 16th youth uprising against education segregation, amongst others. And joining us now via Zoom are Professor Labby Ramrathan from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, who is currently working on a paper called Moving from Education for All to Education for Relevance, and Dr Miriam Altman, an economist and a commissioner with the National Planning Commission. Thanks so much to both of you for joining us this morning, and welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning.
Morning.
Professor, if I could start with you, how has the curriculum in previously disadvantaged schools evolved since 1976?
Well, I think the most noticeable change has been a shift to the outcomes-based education from our aims, objectives, purpose, looking at how we begin to develop competencies in individuals and so forth. So that has been changed, and we had several iterations of curriculum reform since 1994. So there has been ongoing curriculum changes, little stability, and there is still a lot more to do because we haven't answered the fundamental question, which is the curriculum question of what knowledge is most worthwhile and whose knowledge is most worthwhile.
And, I ask that question because if you look at what gave rise to those uprisings in 1976, amongst other things, was the inferior quality of education. And looking at the conditions today, some would argue that not much has changed. If we look at what was happening in 1976, you had, for example, in black schools, high schools, there were 38,000 spaces available to accommodate students. And this was to accommodate more than 250,000 students at the time. The learner-to-teacher ratio unacceptably high, and some would argue that is still very much the same today. So how has government fared in terms of addressing some of those legacies from the past?
I think the fundamental issue around that is what is quality education? And because of the relativity of the concept quality, it becomes difficult to measure what it means. So quality from the government side would be to say, let's provide more classrooms in schools. And if they can account for an increase in number of classrooms in schools, then they would say that we have introduced quality. I mean, some of the challenges that we have experienced way back, for example, language, it's still a big issue in schools. Inclusion, we've actually categorized schools in terms of quintile rankings. So the quintile rankings were really about determining the kind of state of the school in terms of infrastructure and opportunities for good teaching and learning. And by now, for example, we should have done away with quintile 1, 2, and 3 schools and moved all into quintile 4 schools and 5 schools so that you have better conditions for teaching and learning. So there's a lot of things that have not been focused. In terms of the curriculum, we still have the same traditional disciplines that are informing our subjects that we teach in schools. Yet the entire world has shifted. We are into a multidisciplinary living environment, yet we still stick to kind of disciplinary knowledge. So this, although we have engaged a lot with the curriculum and have made substantial changes in terms of curriculum, but the curriculum is not assisting the majority of the people. A simple example is that, for example, our matric results, as in terms of either you pass with a diploma, with a higher certificate, with a bachelor's degree. What that suggests is that we actually streaming all our learners towards higher education. The reality of it is only 17% of the students actually access higher education. So what happens to the rest of them?
Dr. Altman, and to bring you in here, in 2010, the NPC's diagnosis identified education as one of the 9 areas that needed great attention. But it's not just your findings that showed this up. Other reports, including those of the World Bank, of the International Monetary Fund, they advised the same. But looking at what's happened over the past 10 years, some would say it almost seems like a wave of cognitive dissonance between what government knows, what they are saying, and what is actually happening on the ground. So what's your assessment of the past 10 years?
Well, the first thing is that, there's just no doubt that investment in people it's always the most important thing that has to be focused on. There's just no doubt about it. Any country that wants to get ahead has to invest in its people. And that's where education comes in. You don't need the World Bank to tell you that. Now the problem is that we have a historical challenge in focusing on people. If there were 2 areas that I would say are number 1 priority, and the state would agree with that, it's building state capacity, and building human capacity is absolutely essential to moving ahead. Now, when we say that there's been no progress over the past 10 years. Sorry. When you say that, it's not quite correct. There's no doubt that we fall very low in the rankings. But when you are trying a very deep problem like the standard of education in South Africa, the starting point was very low. You do have to mark the improvements. So since you started with that question, there's no doubt that there's a long way to go. But there actually have been South Africa is seen as the big improver globally. Actually, if you look at the comparative studies that are done on math, science, reading, you'll see that South Africa is the biggest improver. The problem is that it's off a low base. Now, the problem now is that we're not actually sure why that happened necessarily. To the professor's point about curriculum and stability, the people I work with, like Martin Gustafsson and others who are experts in this area, tell me that they believe that one of the reasons that there was that improvement was the stability of the curriculum. Since, I think, you correct me, Professor, but maybe 2011 in CAPS. Yeah. And so, one of the learnings is that, education is a big bureaucracy. That's the reality. People need routines. They need to know, they need to have continuous learning and improvement, and continuous change is not helpful to that. So that's certainly one of the issues.
So just taking a look at the paper, Education and Skills for the Economy and Links to Labour Markets in South Africa, what would you say, Dr. Altman, has been identified to be problematic in that connection or disconnect between education, skills and the labour market? And how does one go about fixing what is problematic?
Right. Well, let me focus on what the top recommendations of that paper are. And if I can just say, there's two papers that we've put out. One focuses on post-school education as well. So I would urge people to find those 2 papers on our website. If I can just say, it's on the National Planning Commission website, which is very easy to find. It says nationalplanningcommission.org, and it's under publications and then reports. And then there's 2 education papers, and we are asking for public comment by July 8th. So I would urge people, if they're interested in this area, which I hope everybody is, that they look at those papers and give us feedback. So if I could just get that across quickly. Now, at the highest point, some of the recommendations, if I can just summarize. One is, the authors say reboot the NDP's focus on accountability and schooling. Now, there's nothing that's more important on many levels than that, because that affects the behavior and the commitment to performance. So, for example, bringing back the something like a national testing regime in grade 3, 6, and 9. It is an example of something that we lost track of. Again, the professor will correct me, but I think it was around, again, 2011 or a number of years ago anyway. It was quite a while ago. So we haven't had regular national across-the-board testing. What we have now is we have testing in schools. The Dell Foundation has done fantastic work with the Department of Education to develop the data-driven districts. So there is a better capability to monitor performance in schools as well, and we should leverage that. I've been talking before, even on your show, about the need for incentives in post-school education, where maybe vice chancellors of schools and CEOs of post-school education institutions have some of their personal pay tied to getting students through and how many people get employed out the door, to motivate them. It's not that type of thing isn't unheard of internationally. So that's the first area is the whole area of accountability. The second area is around a focus on improving reading in the foundation phases. In other words, the early grades is something that the president's latched onto. There's growing capability. For example, Nick Spull at Stellenbosch and others have done fantastic work. Xenix Foundation have done fantastic work to build up know-how around how we get early grade reading, foundation level reading strengthened, because that, if you don't get that right, then everything else after that is expensive and difficult. Thirdly, improving monitoring in education and knowing what's going on, and that's particularly a problem in post-school education. It's and particularly in vocational training. So not everybody's supposed to go to university in any country, but a lot of people should be in some kind of post-school training that ups their capability, to prepare them for work. And we really have very little idea of what's going on in that sector or how to improve quality, therefore. And then now that, because of COVID, we're going to have to think about the technical, digital education. And as much as we have downplayed that, although 4IR is very important, getting these foundational level capabilities is more important. But the reality is that digital is going to progress very fast now as a result of COVID, and not just in education, but across the board. And that means preparing the population to be e-ready is absolutely essential. And we are really going to have to up our game around that. Maybe just like one final thing that, in fact, those papers don't raise is the whole area of nation building is something that usually happens in school. It's incredibly important to cohesion and people's sense of being a part of a society. And that really needs to rise. Now, if I could just weigh in, the professor said a few things that I really need to attend to. The first is that we shouldn't have quintile 1 to 3 schools. Now, quintile 1 to 3 schools, I'm not sure if that's what you meant, Professor, but quintile 1 to 3 schools are located in quintile 1 to 3, in other words, low-income communities. That's what they mean. So those schools have actually progressed quite significantly in the past 10 years. It is one of the successes. In fact, I've spoken again on the show before about this, that one of the big successes since 2008 is a dramatic increase in the number of in the proportion of bachelor's passes from the low-income schools. So more than half of the bachelor's passes, in other words, people who are ready, who qualify for university, now come from those low 1, 2, 3 quintile schools. That's a huge achievement. So we can't get rid of those schools. What we need to do is continuously invest in them so we get equity, as much equity as we can in the quality of schools across the board. I just felt that I had to weigh in on that point.
And Professor, if you want to respond to that, you may. But I also just want to move along to what Dr. Altman is saying about these quintile 1, 2, and 3 schools. Talking about 4IR, if we still have schools where children don't have any sanitation facilities, where they still have pit latrines, where you have buildings that are dilapidated, and you're told by the departments that they actually spend 80% in some instances on paying salaries of teachers. When are we going to address these backlogs in infrastructure, for one? When are we going to progress to the level of seeing 4IR being implemented in these schools, given that their basic conditions are already poor and don't seem to be improving? When I spoke to Minister Angie Motshekga at the beginning of the year, she was basically defeated and saying, this is the reality. And in some instances, there's very little to nothing that we can do. And this is the cognitive dissonance that I'm talking about, Professor.
Yeah, I think, look, in terms of the number of students accessing higher education, for example, our university has almost 2/3 of its students who are coming from quintile 1, 2, and 3 schools. The issue that I'm speaking about is really about the infrastructure that's there for conducive teaching and learning. Because if you want quality learning to take place, there needs to be a good quality environment to support and promote learning. I mean, we don't have to just get into a pass grade and access university, because even when students do come to university, the attrition rates of students is quite high. And part of the literature is suggesting that students are underprepared for higher education and so forth. So I think what we need to think seriously is really about how to get the school infrastructure. Yes, we have, good quality teachers that are available. We focused a lot on developing early learning and paying a lot of attention to those things. And those are foundations to it. But we need to progressively move. We are, as Dr. Altman said, we are in a fast-paced change environment. And how do we prepare our learners for that? The work environment is not stable. That environment is increasingly changing at a fastest pace, basically in terms of the 21st century characteristics. And how do we prepare our learners for all of these changes? The infrastructure in terms of the digital technologies has to be in place. It has to be now the foundation and the fundamental aspects of teaching and learning. And so we need to develop it. We can't say that the learners cannot access or use these technologies, but if you provide the technologies that are available to them, learning is innate to humans.
But let's look at the objective realities, Dr. Altman. You talk about the FET sector, for example, and in the diagnostic report, that is also flagged as something that needs to be looked at. 10 years on, that problem still persists in that and I suppose this is why many do not look at that as an option, because of the state, the poor quality of education and the state of those FET colleges. Dr. Altman?
Yeah. Again, the first thing I need to say is I'm not sure that the minister, Mashekha, is feeling defeated. I think what she's saying is that the objective conditions are, there's no doubt that she's facing great challenges. But I don't, unless I didn't hear the interview, but I doubt that she said that she was defeated. I think she's trying step by step to make improvements. The reality is that let's look at TVET, the vocational education schools. The number of students enrolled in those schools has trebled over the past decade. So on that level, there's been progress. But as we know that there are huge quality issues. And so they've stopped expanding those numbers, which is a problem. It makes sense to stop the numbers when you've got these kinds of quality issues. But then what you need to do is you need to invest in them and improve them. And there are ways of doing that even with in the context of weak state capacity. For example, these ambitious targets around post-school education, universities and particularly vocational would benefit a lot from private and foreign investment. I mean, that's something that's done in China, and in Singapore and Vietnam, and in many countries. If we're lacking capacity and we don't have the kinds of finances we need, then that is something that we should be welcoming. But the reality is there's been resistance to that. So public post-school education and training institutions, for example, can't access the public subsidy that public institutions do, which is a problem. And it doesn't have to be private institutions even. It can be partnerships. It can be partnerships with companies, auto manufacturers and all sorts of companies that partner with TVETs to develop curricula, teach, have what they call co-op programs, where you place people for internships. There's all kinds of ways, but we've really got to up our game around how we're partnering with how the public sector is partnering with the private sector, particularly in the vocational education area. There's no other way to do it.
So we are out of time. Just one final question to both of you very briefly. Professor and then Dr. Altman, do you think that we will meet the target set out by the NDP by 2030, given where we are and the pace at which we're moving? Professor, you first.
It's unlikely. There's a whole lot of things that need to be considered. I think we are progressing, we're moving along within the capacities and capabilities that we have, but I think we need more inclusion and support to go forward and to try and meet, to some way, at least achieve a sizable proportion of that development.
And Dr. Altman?
We'll meet some of the targets, but we'll struggle to meet, the full set of education targets. But I think what we should focus on to be productive is whether we're on the right trajectory. And this is why the NPC has stepped in to produce this work, to look at how to course correct. It's not as though the Department of Education isn't working on any of these things, but what we want to do is make the public aware of some of the actions that need to be strengthened, that they should focus on as civil society and that government should focus on to get things on the right path. The best that we can do is to get the momentum moving faster and get more inclusion and more public involvement is also critical to improving education systems.
Well, thank you so much to both our guests, Dr. Miriam Altman from the National Planning Commission and Professor Labby Ramrathan from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, discussing how far forward our education system has or perhaps has not moved as we look at 44 years since the June 16th uprising. And that brings us up to news time. Leanne standing by.